It's a great pleasure to welcome and introduce now Janine Tang, who comes to us from Bard College in the state of New York. Janine Tang is an art historian, teaching as senior academic advisor and Luma Fellow at Bard Center for Curatorial Studies since 2010. One of the aspects we were so much interested in was her knowledge about exhibition history and making, as well as her thinking of critical transgender infrastructures. Her essays on exhibition history and contemporary art have appeared in such venues as Art Forum, Art Journal, Theory, Culture and Society, Journal of Visual Culture, and Art India, in addition to exhibition catalogs and books, including the recent Trapdoor, Transcultural Production and the Politics of the Visibility in 2017. Last year, she curated with Lia Gangitano and Ann Butler the exhibition The Conditions of Being Art, Pat Hearn Gallery and American Fine Arts, at the Center for Curatorial Studies that holds both archives of these galleries, and I'm sure Janine will get back to this in relation to Cady Noland. Currently, Janine is working on 2 books, one on profiling as figuration in the 1970s, and another on legacies of the British Penal Code in South and Southeast Asia. Please help me in welcoming Janine Tang.
Hi. Thank you all so much, Suzanne, Evelyn, and Anna, for organizing today and inviting me. It's a real treat to be here, and such a privilege, I think, also to be able to see this exhibition. It's a real achievement. And so today, I'm going to do something that feels pretty modest to me. I'm going to look at the material interactions and placement of some of Cady Noland's works in the couple of years between 87 and 89. And it feels pretty nascent and provisional to me, so I hope you'll take it in that spirit. I'd like to first begin with the words of artist and writer Gretchen Faust in her 1988 review of Noland's work in Nike magazine. Faust sketched a dual context for Noland's work within the late 80s, within what critics then called neo-geometric, neo-conceptual art, and also, on the other hand, the wake of appropriation art's revival and reassessment. In Faust's words, quote, "In a society whose value system is based primarily on money, art is constantly struggling to expand beyond its assigned function as commodity. It may be an unavoidable condition of making art in the context of our culture, but one way to deal with the problem and tackle the limitation of being a commodity is to use the predicament as material. This approach has come into vogue in the recent revival of appropriation art and the so-called neo-geo trend. Sadly, much of this potentially subversive work has become what it has so vehemently criticized." End quote. This reevaluation of appropriation strategies, that is to say, the taking, relocation, and recontextualization of objects and images from their initial contexts or locations, was critically articulated 5 years prior to Faust's writing. In 1983, Douglas Crimp reassessed the status of appropriation strategies and his own earlier defense of them. Quote, "The strategy of appropriation no longer attests to a particular stance towards the conditions of contemporary culture. To say this is both, to suggest that appropriation did at first seem to entail a critical position, and to admit that such a reading was altogether too simple. Appropriation, pastiche, quotation, these methods now extend to virtually every aspect of our culture, from the most cynically calculated products of the fashion and entertainment industries to the most committed critical activities of artists. If all aspects of the culture use this new operation, then the operation itself cannot indicate a specific reflection upon the culture." End quote. Crimp saw an imminent threat in the prevailing use of appropriation, the risk that it was becoming, quote, "just another academic category or thematic," quote, "through which the museum organizes its objects," end quote. In the wake of what Crimp then called, in his essay title, "Appropriating Appropriation," Faust suggested some other ways forward for those artists who would repurpose images and objects in culture, focusing on the work of Cady Noland and also others like Tom Mahady. Faust proposed that, quote, the issues of art and artist as object and the plight of the object might still be successfully addressed. She offered Noland's art as something particularly generative in, quote, appropriating objects and assembling them into limited conditions, scare quotes that were in her original text, to forcefully depict the conditions that bind. To expand on what Faust might have meant by the conditions and conditions that bind, I want to consider a few works by Cady Noland produced and exhibited in the late 1980s, and I'm going to start with her 1989 mutated pipe, thank you MMK for the install image, in which a scaffold pole is horizontally affixed to the wall, with objects hung from it, and these include a window crank, leather buckle, snap hook, parade stick, drop strap, tax table that Peter gave us a sort of glimpse into, metal grate, brittle American flag, metal rings, and laces. Mutated pipes, material interactions, imply relations of restraint and dominance between the objects themselves. The tax toy bowl overtakes the pole, a dish rack is suspended in one corner and cuffed at another, American flag is bound tensely by its own rope, a corner is pulled up, the tugging of fabric exacerbated by the presence of a brittle to the left. Visual tensions arise from the control of both absent bodies that are nonetheless implied, while the interactions of materials suggest dynamics of hierarchy and dominance in how they cling to one another, use one another, how they stretch, suspend, restrain, dangle, and grip. Mutated pipe is one of several works made in the 80s that featured bars affixed to walls from which objects would be ostensibly hung. For instance, in another work, also 89, The Big Slide, a series of objects are arrayed around a metal mount or otherwise clutch at it. Phone cord boxes are rolled on, folded American flag is draped on, a grab rail holds a section of the pole in a vice-like grip. The materials list for The Big Slide, similar to mutated pipe, includes mounting and hanging devices, such as large paper clips, wall hooks, metal rings, from which other objects are affixed or suspended. Some everyday objects not so typically used for installation are also pressed into such practical service, like the dish rack to the left that cradles a cane for the blind, on which a bunched up flag is draped. We can also see and consider that black and white flag, whose cartoon menace is further emphasized by an asymmetrical suspension, ring to the left, series of hooks on the right, where a vertical arrays of toothy hooks accentuates the bare jaws of the flag's shark. The relational dynamics of the work's various parts, while steeped in a threatening symbolism of state power and violence, are notably balanced really precariously. They're suspended on wiggly loops, they're crumpled and folded in. As Noland has written, quote, they occupy a kind of nether status in which American flags are treated as so many sections of cloth, end quote, with the uneven distribution of hooks and rings deliberately arranged, evading compositional coherence and irritating, in her words, a visual field. These material arrangements might be understood as, on the one hand, culturally significant, but also as a kind of semiotic noise and crude material. The overall effect is kind of off-kilter and highly controlled due to the dissolution of structural distinction between sculptural and armature and plastic form. That is not to say, however, that the disconcertingly casual effects of the work are completely anti-compositional. The materials and measures and positioning of these are really calculated, as you can see by an installation sketch of mutated pipe, where every inch is accounted for. Faust described also in her writings another work from the late 1980s, The Mirror Device, which is the flagship image for today's event. And in her writings, I was really struck by the spectatorial effect that she described. Quote, a chrome bar secured to the wall pins a found object makeup mirror that, when initially installed, in her words, was flanked by empty electric sockets to the wall. Hanging on the bar, reflected in the mirror, is a fluorescent orange flare gun and a pair of handcuffs. The instruments of fear and restraint are forced to continually face themselves in a condition of confinement. Noland gets to that feeling of hopelessness in experiences where one accepts the conflicting roles society dictates. That reflection shows us with frightening clarity what we are as a society and culture in danger of becoming, a confined people living in fear and restraint, end quote. While I don't have an image of precisely the installation Faust describes, I've been struck, I think, by the placement decision that she drew attention to, and also something that's not available in this image, but comes up in the selfies of the work. I did a hashtag Cady Noland Instagram crawl, so these are all like publicly posted selfies, and yes, I think that's Matthew Higgs on the right. Publicly posted without privacy settings. And what I want to stress here is that mirror device is, on the one hand, very indicative of the materials that Noland's works often employ, steel, aluminum, chrome, specifically for their varying degrees of coolness and reflection that would afford glimpses of the gallery, the spectator, as well as the flare gun and handcuffs. But also, I think, to point to what Noland famously suggested in 1990 relative to these materials, quote, "The mirror effect in some places is to draw you back in after the dissociation," end quote. And I want to spend more time in my remarks to follow on the strategies around the dissociations and associations, the couplings and uncouplings of Noland's work, and to look at those relative to how doors, thresholds, light, rooms, and spectators are drawn in which her art appears really deliberately. In doing so, this method is taking a cue from something Noland once expressed about art criticism's relationship to her own work. Quote, "There are certain euphemistic terms applied to art which I don't like. Pieces are called risky or subversive without any empirical demonstration in terms of the work, the artist, or the viewer. I decided that all that could be said of the viewer or the work is what they did, or what happened." And so to start, I want to also plumb several procedures in Noland's art, so bear with me as I try to track through a few genealogies of sculpture that get us to the place of what we've been seeing, in which sculpture could be quite distinct unto itself, and also the ways in which sculpture occupies architectural space. One of the things that we might note is that many of these works appear to be the result of a kind of additive assemblage methodology, in which parts are combined and manipulated to produce a kind of overall composition. Noland herself has noted efforts to, quote, "lavish undue attention onto the way things are held or put together so that a certain amount of suspicion enters the picture. Hopefully, instead of providing solace, a new source or cause for anxiety can be opened up in relation to the coupling and uncoupling of elements in a way that has no predictable relation to whether things are old or new, or in what manner they are like a random serial killer being on the loose." In her coupling and uncoupling of materials, Noland's works typically forefront a kind of accumulation process, the hoarder conversation that was just had earlier on, that on the one hand point to their mass production and serial repetition, but also the libidinal processes of subject formation. Noland has evocatively referred to her use of Budweiser cans for their design, and those designs being, quote, "tiny units of mastery, an aimless accumulation relating to the body's digestive process, the beer having been pissed go away in an anticlimactic anonymous process," end quote. The appearance of these kinds of accumulations in the late 1980s might be seen, on the one hand, to revise those strategies associated with anti-formalist 1960s process art, in which artists favored seemingly uncomposed or unprocessed approaches to materials, deprivileging iconographic and cultural elusiveness to explore and emphasize the physical properties of the object, the weight of gravity, the effect of entropy, that could then determine the work's final form, rather than the artistic intervention. We might recall how Richard Serra famously flung molten lead into the intersection of wall and floor, or his listing 84 infinitives of production: to roll, to crease, to fold, to twist, etc. However, even as Noland's 1980s work would also use so many rolls, folds, twists, and spills, they did so with other kinds of materials and towards other ends. For instance, in Celebrity Trash Spill, pictured here, it's not the best scan, includes items such as cameras and camera equipment, lenses, tripods, microphones that would connote the kind of paparazzi intrusion of visual vision and light, even as other materials in this heap, like the sunglasses, would seem to be instruments of shade and shielding. Noland has described her use of spills as a mode of psychic anxiety, a loosening of constraint, a relief of inner tension, and messy and pleasurable affect. This discharge of affect via the spill and in the seemingly scattered composition, follows in the wake of postminimal sculpture by Morris, Hesse, and others made prominent in such exhibitions as the Eccentric Abstraction exhibition organized by Lucy Lepard in 1966, who described the many biomorphic soft sculptures and pieces as invoking, quote, a near visceral identification with form through what were ostensibly then non-linguistic and affectively formal works. These spills and their visceral identifications were also notably theorized around a series of abstract pieces, and Lepard's initial curatorial framing held semiotic meaning at bay, ostensibly splitting phenomenal response from cultural elusiveness. However, Noland, in contrast, has cast the spills of her work in particularly linguistic terms across a range of common association and idioms. She's described spilling the beans, spill as an orgasm, spill as an accident, with a welcome mat rolled out and then pulled out from under one's feet, end quote. The very form of a spill seems redolent of vernacular illusion as well. Ralph Rugoff, reviewing her work in the late 80s, fittingly characterized her spills as, quote, using suburban sprawl as an organizational model. Like Jonathan Borofsky, she knows how to overload an exhibition space with clutter. But rather than a whimsical three-ring surface, her installations evince the enervation of a garbage dump. Her placement of objects often appears to be random, as if guided by a low-grade entropy. In places, it's virtually impossible to tell whether the loose screws and cigarette butts spilled on the floor have been intentionally positioned or are rubble left over from the opening, end quote. What Noland has called a downward drag in her work, in which things look drained and wrung out by way of gravitational pull upon the armature, enjoins process art's exploration of entropic material properties with the secondary life of images and information. Particularly, I think, in those metal cutouts from the late 1980s, such as Oswald, again, but also others such as Tanya as a Bandit or SLA Group. All of these also 89. These works would include tabloid, magazine, newsline, or imagery and articles, silk-screened onto print or printed on metal that a viewer would ostensibly look at and read. The life of this imagery is also itself often serially repeated, with similar images appearing across multiple works, and some of these repetitions violently punctured with what appears to look like bullet holes after target practice. It's not me. While I make no claims today about Noland's personal politics as a feminist or her making of feminist art, I do want to think the hard-boiled violence of some of her post-conceptual post-process methods as appearing adjacent to, even though not akin, to conversations in feminist psychoanalytic theory during the late 80s and early 1990s. Mignon Nixon has notably drawn attention to critiques by Cobain Mercer and Jacqueline Rose of psychoanalytic feminist work that would privilege pleasure and desire over hatred and aggression. Nixon quotes Mercer as he observes in 1994, "There is no shortage of text-centered studies of pleasure and desire, but where are the analyses of pain and hatred as everyday structures of feeling too?" End quote. For Nixon, aggression in feminist art of the 90s could be examined generatively through Kleinian theories of aggression that would emphasize object relations and attachments in more abstract bodily sculptural works of the 90s, so often misunderstood as essentialist, relative to the more Lacanian-based studies that would instead open onto more linguistic artistic approaches. Oh. It worked, yeah. Magic touch. All right. Following Nixon, I'd like to suggest that examining Noland's work of the late 80s might help us hold together what has often been held apart, those oppositions of pleasure and aggression, semiotic transmission and visceral response, and propose that instead, in Noland's work, such dualisms are coupled and uncoupled across the duration of spectatorial experience and across the life of a work. Indeed, the artist partially conceals the origins and fudges the states, in her words, of the objects that she employs, not always making available sources or authors or materials for news images and articles within the work itself. At the same time, Noland's art does not summon vehicles of meaning only to completely empty them. She occasionally references some of the sources in reproductive formats. She's been known to distribute Xeroxes, accompanying exhibitions. She's also pretty careful about work titles and materials lists to include sources of information. For instance, when the Whitney Museum was presenting Ulswald, she made sure that they included the photographer's credit, Bob Jackson, in the materials list, and was pretty insistent on that point. Crucial to the advent of semiotics and art criticism of the late 70s and 80s was the recognition of meaning's ongoing production, the arbitrariness and adventure of the signifier, the possibilities of subsequent and reconfigured meanings as sculpture moved, traveled, appeared in new configurations and presentational spaces, is something Noland seems to have seriously considered at this point in the late 80s within her work's construction and maintenance. Production notes indicate that Noland was concerned with opportunities for further completion or intervention upon a work during subsequent shows, as she writes, quote, "For many pieces, the possibilities of continuance are left open by stray loops, etc., with the thought that perhaps there will be an opportunity to add more later on. There is an avoidance of announcing that something is finished because it might always be improved. A good way to decipher these pieces is to look at how they behave. A sculpture might have a will and be afforded opportunities as well as barriers," end quote. And so with an eye towards how sculpture behaves in the present, while being open to how it could simultaneously behave in the future, Noland previously requested of her galleries that photographs of her work would not be disseminated with the general title of installation view, but that pictures should always include their art titles, of which she also published a compilation of in Assemblage magazine. In Noland's words, quote, "I think that the titles are really important, and otherwise the pieces are totally abstract. Also, they are individual pieces anyway, and they weren't made at the same time or originally conceived of together," end quote. We might then understand Noland's work, use of seriality, repetition, reproduction, appropriation, as working opportunistically within the drift of semiotic transmission, but with a kind of concomitant material drag, in which gravitational pulls upon the support skeleton and frame seem to be, in her words, shaking off images as if they were drying up or burning off, end quote. Indeed, the possibilities of an image's degradation and entropy not only included her work upon its surface, but her actions upon its support. For the sculpture Chainsaw Cut Cowboy Head of '89, Noland notably sent her gallerists some maintenance instructions that would permit the cleaning of the sculpture's recto, but not its verso side, allowing the accumulation of dust and the risk of entropy and decay to pull upon the work. In making such works as this and others, Noland has also observed curatorial anxieties over preventing a work of art's decay, this as a testament to the displacement of a desire for mastery, in her words, and I'm going to quote a big one at length here. "Sculptures are sometimes made to appear as if they don't exist in the world, but on a more ethereal plane. I have noticed with feelings of anxiety, however, Donald Judd pieces, which are 10 to 15 years old and veterans of many shows, that have little nicks or slight discolorations. When I made the piece Dirt Chorale, I was thinking how floor sculptures tend to collect dust and about the anxiety and maintenance this tendency creates. The sheer amount of attention and activity surrounding this removal of dust and the fretful feelings it stirs seems ridiculously solemn and ludicrous. I decided to make a piece which exaggerated this problem, using in part an ornate headboard full of big gaps that could potentially collect trash as well as having an L attachment which could corral dirt laterally as if one was trying to herd livestock. I wanted to blow up or maximize this aspect of sculpture, which is usually supposed to be suppressed, by making an actual kind of dirt sponge. Ideally, I would like to make works which, rather than appearing to master displace anxiety, mirror the anxiety itself," end quote. In rejecting sculpture's more figurative and idealist traditions, which includes the institutional support for those traditions, and by turning instead to additive assemblage, post-minimal methods, we might think of the anthropic accumulations of material and dirt around Noland's work as not only directed by the work's production, but its material life, its curatorial maintenance, its preservation. This was also implicating the space and bureaucracy of a sculpture's situation. Noland stressed the direct placement of her pieces on floors, locating the material, architectural, and curatorial labors of the gallery within the field of the work. In her words, sculpture had to, quote, forego the white cipher of the wall or pedestal, which function as vehicles of symbolism and euphemism in favor of the floor, which is simply base, end quote. This shift for Noland to the floor in the late 80s was, in some senses, the culmination of many prior decades of sculptural investigation that Jack Burnham concisely theorized in 1968. And I'm going to quote him here at length on the shift from from pedestal to floor. The base is the sculptor's convention for rooting his art to surrounding reality while permitting it to stand apart. As such, the base creates a twilight zone, both physically and psychically. It says, in effect, that the sculpted object has a life, a presence of its own. It's used to support very top-heavy standing figures and provide a perch to minimize damage, as are the obvious physical reasons for its existence. Beyond that, the base helps create an aura of distance and dignity around the favored object. The base has, this is in 68, declined in its purpose of psychological segregation to become the means of physically isolating one class of objects from all others, namely sculpture. That sculpture could be created by setting any object upon a base became a chief dialectical dilemma of modern sculpture. All objects, thereby, could be considered sculpture, a popularization which has turned modern sculpture away from the base as a means of identification. If the base was rendered meaningless, both physically and psychically, sculpture could only regain meaning, free of its confines, end quote. I do, though, want to mark Noland's explicit situation of her sculpture on the floor, a good 20 years after this theorization, did not propose a freeing of the medium, but rather an investigation of sculpture's spatial constraints in an age of installation art. Noland's art of the late 80s appeared amidst a boom in gallery-scaled installation, which the artist assiduously countered in the reception of her work. To understand the difference, we might compare her to artists such as Jessica Stockholder or Jessica Diamond. So in this installation, Money Having Sex, from also 1989, Diamond used the anti-commodity production of conceptual art, application of sign painter's acrylic directly to the wall, calling to mind the kind of hand-drawn labors of Solowit and others, this being twinned with the political and economic concerns of the 80s and the language of commercial design. Critics and artists noted the work's explicit reference to capitalism and commerce and the unabashed, aggressive, and insouciant implication of commercial transaction on a gallery's walls of aesthetic distinction. The distinctiveness of Noland's methods also separate her art from the methods of her peers. I think particularly when the situation of her work on the floor was pursued as a means to emphasize sculpture's behavior and those procedures of placement, juxtaposition, and maintenance that would inform that behavior. Noland would regularly insist to her dealers, her curators, and writers that her work consisted of individual pieces made independently of one another and that they did not comprise full-room installations. That said, on the other hand, these sculptures were also in no way fully autonomous or independent. The pieces were not interchangeable in how they could be aggregated, as the artist sought regular involvement and approval over the placement, selection, and presentation of her work. Indeed, Noland's placement is, I think, quite remarkable for its regular intervention into the social spatial dynamics of any gallery that it's placed in. And I really liked seeing this installation image here. I think it's also the MMK. That requires that a spectator would walk towards, away, and around the work. The work's placement disrupts a kind of perambulatory space, and it also intrudes into sort of paths of egress. Indeed, I think many have noted that Noland's work is regularly keyed to the proportions of the architectural interior, its placement bisecting museum pillars, and this is made possible by the variable dimensions of artworks that allow them to be scaled or bent down differently to different spaces. Consequently, the sense of menace that so many have remarked on, produced by Noland's work, is an effect not only of the coupling and uncoupling of materials, for instance, the interaction of two different mounts, but also the couplings and uncouplings of materials relative to the built environment. Noland herself initially turned to long metal tubes, poles, and bars due to the length of a spectator's walk through the gallery and their combination within a given space. In her words, quote, "It annoyed me that a person in an art gallery would walk from one art incident to another, that there would be a blank space in between. It seemed like such a fixed relationship. And in a sense, it would matter what was on the wall. At that point, I started working with things like poles that tracked your movement across the room, almost sympathetic with your movement, end quote. We might think of this tracking of the spectator by the work as something quite necessary for an artist using so many signs and artifacts redolent of American state power. Noland recognized a real risk in her work, that a spectator might not apprehend these critically or anxiously, but instead revel in a profusion of patriotic signification. As a result, Noland's sculpture, while aggregate, is decidedly not an art of metaphor or of transformation. Instead, works seem to manipulate and corral their spectators. In her words, quote, "It is only these types of traps and enforced boundaries that keeps other parts from it from turning into a kind of oceanic imperialist orgy," end quote. As a result, Noland's placement has often sought to block off paths of egress or render hazardous a spectator's phenomenological encounter to implicate the space in which her work is situated. By way of an example, here's an installation image of the '89 solo exhibition of Cady Noland's work at American Fine Arts that featured a number of pieces and sculptures arranged in a broader installation. There were 6 large sheets of reflecting material, screened with blocks of text and old-fashioned tabloid pictures. Many of the materials were drawn from an American history book detailing peripheral details of Abraham Lincoln's assassination, such as the cot that he died on, the coat that he wore. And in another work, Our American Cousin, sculpture featuring beer cans and metal walkers. Its objects and title refer to the play that Abraham Lincoln attended the night of his assassination. But what I want to direct our attention to more is sculptures whose proportions were deliberately scaled to the gallery, those assuming the look of metal cages, hindering or directing the viewer's perambulation through space. One of these, gate-barred doors, and you can sort of see it like way in the back corner, was situated in a doorway between the front gallery and back office, while another, reception cage, occupied a substantial portion of the gallery's back room, proximate to where art dealer Colin DeLange conducted his gallery business. Such works intervened within the social spatial dynamics of the gallery, barricading a reception desk of welcome, blocking off access to the inner sanctum of the gallery back room that was so noted as a hangout space for people in the art world at the time. In conceiving the exhibition, Noland saw a relationship of the reception area to the office sanctum in the office space as a general, quote, a priori model of conditioned relationships between men and women, whether in a gallery office or for the presidency, end quote. In Jan F. Gikos's review of this exhibition, she described the effects of the works as such. This descriptive phenomenology extends to the enabling feature of her, Noland's, installations, portable metal barricades, wire containers, wall-mounted bars, which inframe and otherwise administer the display of mendicant goods. The gesture of containment accomplishes desultory territorial definition, and by isolating specific social arenas, establishes a prerequisite for spectacular display. One such arena is that of the gallery itself, making clear the connection between the authoritarian mission of the barricades and architecture as twin euphemisms for management and control. Noland turns the barricades loose in the gallery, caging in the front reception desk, erecting a metal security gate at the entrance for the back room, fencing off the director's desk and couch. To those who would inhabit these libidinal arenas, they would become part of the display. Whether they occupy privileged spaces or prisons is deliberately left up for grabs, end quote. Indeed, during the run of the show, gallery directors did have to work in these confined and caged spaces on display for those viewers whose experience of the works were also themselves subject to possible physical constraint. The arrangement and layout would cramp the viewer's experience. It would confine their paths through the gallery. It would require that they exercise degrees of caution as they move through the space. For instance, the thin metal panels with silk screens were placed directly on the floor, and in Noland's words, quote, "These beseeched of the spectator not to violate their clearly delicate condition through casual social intercourse, swinging one's umbrella, backing into the wall, and in the case of gate-barred door, not to attempt to open it and enter if the door is closed, even if there is no latch to prevent further impediment," end quote. Producing such works as Gate Bar Door were intended to create stultifying conditions of being entrapped and subject to the scrutiny of passerbys. Production notes for Gate Bar Door also initially required the work to be additionally tall, 12 feet high, open to the ceiling, while the reception cage in the back room required placement as close to desk as possible. For works such as these, the behavior of Noland's sculpture might be seen as a herding and manipulation of viewership, with architecture exploited to, quote, dramatize rather than smooth over transitional phases in social relations, end quote. Noland being interested especially in how barricades or suggestive additions and subtractions from everyday architecture could highlight, irritate, and frustrate a viewer's typical expectations. And I want to emphasize that these aren't just like any expectations of going through a space, they're really specific. You're used to going into AFA in this specific way, right? To like go hang out with Colin in the back. And that's what the work was disrupting. The frustrations stirred up by Noland's art also drew from a correspondence between her position and earlier ideas of playwright Richard Foreman of the ontologic hysteric theater, who set out the importance of not assuaging a spectator's desire for entertainment and narrative denouement, who instead sought out a parallel form of disorienting spectators by way of what he called a theater of non-acts. Noland sought out another kind of disorientation that I think is somewhat akin to Foreman's in the field of sculpture. In her work, the social relations and conditions were not only seen as binding, but potentially coupled and uncoupled endlessly. The very naming of a piece such as Gate Bar Door would itself prevent a work from being seen through only one concept and thereby close. The triple nouns of the title instead open onto varying degrees of perceptual and architectural prohibition, access, and threat that an object could simultaneously produce. Or, to close with a quote by Noland, I would like to influence the trip that someone goes on to get somewhere, rather than their destination, which is to say, make the means as important as the ends, not a very American idea, finally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janine.